I've had to learn to like use the strengths and try and taper them down and try and develop my weaknesses. And I think like this is what we're all doing. Am I right or wrong when it comes to shadow work? Isn't that really what you're doing?
Yeah, tempering your strengths and what were you doing with your weaknesses?
Well, trying to develop them.
Developing them. Yeah, mainly developing the weaknesses, because we've gotten really good usually in life at doing in service and like survival. Like we can get our bills paid, we can be stable, but the ability to be like have inner joy and like feel like you have like real expression of your inner self to the world that you can share in a safe way. To be able to achieve that, you have to go through a kind of transformative process and focus more on what was your weakness, which will now become more of a strength, because it's now going to be a strength. Your weakness is your kind of your ego, is your separation of self, delusions, where you don't really see the connection to the world. You see more of the divisions that separate things. And then when you can step into shadow work, you start to focus more on being able to see the connections of things. And so the delusions become the weakness, and the strength becomes the new vision of being able to understand how things are more interconnected, and how it starts with being able to understand yourself and master yourself. And then being in a world, it starts to take form that what you've achieved can then be like imposed upon the world as something that is can offer guidance if people want to also achieve that inner joy and overcome the inner turmoil that we carry with us when we're just in that service mode.
I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. I like that you bring the word service mode into it, because life is going to serve us as serving, whether we like it or not. The ball will be put in our court, right? Your plate will be filled up. You will end up having to deal with a full plate, as the metaphor goes. The ball will be put in your court, as the metaphor goes. And you will end up serving a master, whether you like it or not. And I think this is a really interesting idea. It sort of brings us to the idea of free will. I think free will sits between the activist and the mystic, because we think our will is free because we're active and we're doing things, but we don't know like where's the string pulling happening, right? And when we are in the mystic state, entering into that gnosis of the mystic, then it seems like we don't have free will on some level, right? That illusion that the free will isn't real can come up. But I think somewhere in the middle of all of this, namaste, Rob. How are you doing, man? Lovely, man. Good to have you here. I hope you guys in the chat are doing well. I'm trying to catch up with you guys. Have been having lovely conversations here. And hey, Big Gaz, is that you as Chaos, by the way? I think it's Big Gaz. Am I right? I get the feeling it's you. But yeah, I do think that like that balance and the free will. What do you guys think? Like looking at free will as a concept, how does free will apply to the idea of this archetypal activist and the archetypal mystic?
Well, no, the principle of free will is from Christianity is somewhat contradictory, because there's like an ultimatum of like in order to have salvation from damnation, you have to follow certain like ultimatums, and there's no free will in like operating out of fear and doing things because you don't want to be punished. That doesn't mean that you don't want to still do those bad things. So I think there's a distinction between that kind of Christian free will, where there's fear of God as driving your free will to choose to follow and serve rules that are laid down for you whether or not they serve your personal good. And then you have like other ways in which free will is a choice between um, being able to take the power into your own hands and take action to make things happen, and like be your own doctor, for example, or the free will to sit by and just go into the system and become a cash cow and let them work you through. And whether those doctors, some doctors out there have really good intentions, and usually they have to go against their usual uh, course of action to like really help people and tell them more about like lifestyle and vitamin and diet changes and things like that that could really help complement whatever kind of treatment they're going to need. That stuff's out there, and it's available in integrative medicine. But a lot of doctors, they have really good intentions, but they just follow what they're trained about pharmaceuticals and medical technology for surgeries, and they're kind of salespeople for pharmaceuticals and medical tech. So it's not that they didn't have good intentions going into it to want to really help people, and or that they don't really actually help people, because they do. But that can be a thing where if you kind of just don't educate yourself about treatments that you're going to need or other things that you can do in your own life to help deal with the situation you're in, instead of leaving it up to people once you get into a crisis and go into the sick care system once it's too late, to work on preventative ways to stay away from conditions, to get into health and wellness. We all have free will in that sense, that we can choose to take things into our own hands or ask for help or have someone else do it for us.
I think another way to think of the dynamic between activist and mystic is speaker and listener. Because if you think about, I never bought the idea. Maybe at one point I did, but at least now I don't buy the idea that, when you sit and meditate, you essentially lose yourself. Well, I mean, it's obvious you would make that observation, because when you're sitting down and you're meditating, you're basically, you're not physically doing anything. You're trying to not come up with any mental thoughts of your own, and you're not trying to invoke any feelings of your own. So if you do all those things at once, of course you're going to come to that conclusion. But to me, that's kind of a confirmation bias. And the way I look at it is that that's not where you find the self. Whereas if you're in more of an activist mode and you're doing things and you're kind of being active, I think you find yourself in activity, not necessarily in inactivity. And I think what was I going to say about the whole free will thing? I had a thought. But yeah, I think a lot of it, when you, another way that you can kind of lose yourself is if you're really engrossed in a movie. So when you watch a movie that's really engrossing, or any kind of book or television show, you begin to focus on the characters so much, the things that are happening to them. It's almost like you forget that you, the observer, are watching, because you're so invested. But I think, to me, when there's a kind of a free will in that you're actively being passive and letting the information kind of absorbing in. So when you're in that meditative state, you're in a kind of you're a receptacle at that point, and you're choosing to be a receptacle. Because if you think about, if you don't have any free will in meditation, it's like, have you ever meditated so deeply that you don't know how to stop meditating? I think most people would at least be able to, stop meditating at some point and get off and go about their normal day. But I think if one wanted to test to see if they really lost their sense of self when they're meditating, it would be like, you wouldn't be able to stop meditating. You wouldn't be able to, reach for yourself and gain it back. I think it's more just kind of like, you just sort of like, you kind of put it aside for a second. It's like you have this self, but you put it in the closet, And it may be, you know, and it's almost like with a weird thing, it's almost like a lack of object permanence. They think if the self is not, you know, there for a moment, then it must have never been there to begin with. But really, it's just sort of waiting in the closet for you. Because even when you go to sleep and you don't dream, you're essentially kind of losing that individual self. And yet, when you wake up, you always go back to that same self. So I think in a lot of ways, when you're talking about panpsychism and stuff, I think that the self is kind of a and you know, people talk about a kind of an internal struggle. Is there's a kind of like you know, matter has consciousness, but there's different kind of levels and gradations of consciousness, where matter first has just kind of the conscious of basic physicality of sort of like moving around, you know, bouncing off of other atoms, changing its state when it reacts to different levels of temperature. And then there's the matter that's alive, that generally has a sense of will and independent sort of consciousness that has its own kind of thing. So you're talking earlier about people getting stuck in certain patterns. I think if you think about matter, it kind of has a sort of momentum and it just kind of wants to drift along, and it wants to. And then when we try to change that, we're met with resistance, because that kind of that you know, physical matter within us just kind of wants to drift along. It doesn't necessarily want to, you know, motivate and, you know, move forward, because it's lazy. So we come up with routines and rituals to kind of steer matter to move in a different direction. So I guess what I'm saying is, you know, when it comes to the free will debate, I think it's that we do have free will, but that we're also influenced by other wills, both within us and outside of us. So it's actually, I think it's kind of like a more like we have partial free will, or mostly free will. So I think it's more a matter of degree of, you think of the dichotomy between the self and the universal mind, and you think how much of this is my perception and how much of this is the universal mind. Because you think about something like a rock, for example, a rock is conscious, but it's only kind of acting within the consciousness of that greater universal mind. It doesn't really have, that individual rock may not have as much of an individual will. So maybe that has like, you know, maybe 1% free will and 99% of that is the will of the universe. Whereas with human beings, that might be more like 80 to 90%, or maybe 50% if you, or maybe like 30 if you're really indoctrinated. I mean, these numbers are just, you know, straight out of the ether. They really don't mean anything. But I guess the point is, I think when it comes to free will, I know that, you know, this is kind of a cringe word because of the woke, but spectrum. I think that there's that free will. It's not necessarily a matter of, does this have a free will and does this lack free will, but rather how much free will does it have relative to the will of the universe. So it's like you have something that's like a rock that has like 1% of its own free will, and 90% of that is the will of the universe. Whereas maybe a human has like 90% of its own free will, but then 10% of that will is the will of the universe. So I try to look at it more in regard to the free will perception from that point of view.
Yeah, free will is an interesting one. There's a lot of contradictions in like free will, and that like we consider it to be fully free, in that there's a lot of things that we have, you know, there's contingencies of, like we have to breathe and stuff, and we have to do certain things, and we have certain needs. But one thing to consider is that like if the elite consider us to be the willfully ignorant, it's up to our will to self-educate ourselves. And if we don't self-educate ourselves, the powers that be are laughing at us, apparently. So according to the testimony. So, well, some of them are, at least. And they consider us to be willfully ignorant, or the walking dead, some refer to us as. So if the collective is willfully ignorant, like why are we willfully ignorant? Because we're given systems of ignorance is bliss and don't question things, perhaps. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think you're completely right. And I think Cosmic, I think you're both really right fundamentally. You know, they are trying to condition us. They are trying to limit us, trying to keep us sort of stuck in this dynamic. I do think that we need to exercise our will. I think we need to exercise all the faculties of consciousness, right, in order to be conscious. Sort of like our bodies, right? What happens when you lay in a bed for too long? Entropy. It'll get to the point where you can't even walk, right? So if we want to stay fit and active and mobile, then we need to be exercising our bodies every day. We need to walk. We need to be active. So you need a certain amount of activism, right? But at the same time, if you're always moving your body and exercising your body and actively, when do you stop to think, consider, like, so there's that balance. And like Cosmic says, the world, and I believe that's what you were getting at, Cosmic, that the world has been sculpted to keep us busy all the time and running, jumping through hoops, right? Financial system, work, career. Like, people don't have time. Is that something you guys hear a lot of? Everybody's saying, oh, I just don't have time.
Yeah, that's the worst excuse, because people would make time. I always tell people, well, you would make time if it was important. We always do.
And I think that's a really interesting point, because at the end of the day, time is the one thing that we have, right? And I'm just trying to get the tarot trumps all cued. It's what I've been doing while you guys have been talking. The world, because I've divided it into two groups, and I think this will sort of be quite useful for people studying the tarot, and for people not studying the tarot as well. I believe it will be useful, because I think it will give us a perspective on basically the archetypal forces and how these forces sort of relate to where we're at. And so the major arcana, I think this consciousness that we're talking about has got to do with the inner world. So when I think of the mystic, I think of the major arcana specifically. When I think of the activist, I think of the numerations specifically. So when I see, the numbers 1 to 10, those are what in the Kabbalah is called the lightning bolt, or the sword of heaven, or the lightning bolt. They relate to the powers, the principalities, and the decisive macrocosmic extensions of possibility that become reality in its different facets. And then the serpent, as it wraps around the tree,